August 15, 1945. Okinawa Prefecture, Ryukyu Islands. The summer heat pressed down upon the limestone caves like a physical weight. Inside the darkness of the southern ridge networks, 23 Japanese women huddled against the volcanic rock, their military-issued cotton uniforms stiff with weeks of dried sweat and coral dust. The air tasted of sulfur and fear. Outside, the sound of American boots crunching against gravel had fallen silent an hour ago, replaced now by something more unsettling. The metallic crackle of loudspeakers echoing across the scorched hillside, broadcasting words in broken Japanese that bounced off the cave walls like accusatory ghosts. The war is over. Emperor Hirohito has surrendered. Come out. You will not be harmed. Nurse Lieutenant Nakamura Fumiko pressed her spine harder against the cave wall, her fingers gripping a rusted scalpel she had salvaged from the field hospital 3 days before the final collapse. She was 24 years old. She had witnessed the suicides. She had heard the screams. She knew what soldiers did to captured women. Every lesson drilled into her mind since 1943 at the Imperial Army Nursing School in Kumamoto had prepared her for this moment. Capture meant defilement, torture, death. Better to die with honor than live with shame. The propaganda films had shown it clearly. American soldiers were beasts, demons in khaki who desecrated everything they touched. But now, the voice on the loudspeaker continued its impossible proclamation. The Emperor has ordered all Japanese military personnel to cease resistance. You are prisoners of war under international law. Medical personnel are waiting. Food and water are ready. Fumiko glanced at the other women in the cave. Some were nurses like her, members of the Haimuri Student Nurse Corps, schoolgirls really, pulled from their classrooms in Naha and thrust into the horror of battlefield medicine. Others were civilian volunteers who had served as comfort station managers or administrative clerks for the imperial garrison. Their faces, illuminated by the dim shaft of afternoon light penetrating the cave entrance, showed the same calculus of terror. They had been told for years what awaited them. They had heard the stories from Saipan, from Tinian, Japanese civilians throwing themselves and their children from cliffs rather than face American capture. Women clutching grenades to their chests. The propaganda had been clear and consistent. Americans showed no mercy to the conquered. The scalpel felt heavier in Fumiko's hand. To understand what happened next in that limestone cave, and in hundreds of similar caves across Okinawa in the late summer of 1945, one must first understand the architecture of fear that governed the Japanese military mind at war's end. This was not merely propaganda. It was theological certainty backed by 4 years of total war ideology. Since December 1941, when Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific with stunning speed, the imperial government had constructed an elaborate narrative about the fundamental incompatibility of Japanese and American civilization. Where Japan represented purity, discipline, and spiritual elevation, America embodied materialistic corruption, racial mongrelization, and moral degeneracy. This wasn't casual wartime rhetoric. It was embedded in school curricula, repeated in radio broadcasts, illustrated in films, and reinforced through every channel of official culture. By 1945, even Japanese citizens who had never seen an American had internalized a specific set of expectations about what American occupation would mean. The treatment of women occupied a particular space in this narrative. Japanese military doctrine emphasized Bushido, the way of the warrior, which held that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, a spiritual death worse than physical annihilation. For women attached to military units, the calculus was even darker. They were told explicitly that American soldiers, particularly the Negro troops who served in segregated units, would rape them as a matter of course. That their bodies would be violated repeatedly before being discarded. That death by suicide, whether by grenade, by poison, or by leaping from a cliff, was not merely preferable but was the only honorable choice available. This wasn't just propaganda, it was policy. Japanese military commanders distributed grenades to civilian families on Saipan and Okinawa with explicit instructions for their use in the event of American capture. Mothers were taught how to hold the grenade against their children's bodies to ensure quick death. School principals gathered students for mass suicide pacts. On Saipan's Marpi Point, over 1,000 Japanese civilians had hurled themselves from the cliffs in June 1944, convinced that the alternative was torture and defilement. By August 1945, when Emperor Hirohito's unprecedented radio broadcast announced Japan's surrender, over 150,000 Japanese civilians had died on Okinawa alone, many by their own hands or those of Japanese soldiers who released them from the shame of capture. The women in Nakamura Fumiko's cave knew these statistics intimately. They had lived through the Battle of Okinawa, had treated the wounded in underground field hospitals, had watched as military doctors distributed cyanide capsules to female staff when the American advance became inevitable. Some of their sisters had taken the poison. Others had used grenades. A few had walked into the ocean with stones in their pockets. The women who remained alive on August 15th were survivors by accident rather than choice. They had been cut off from their units, isolated in caves, missed in the final evacuations. Now they faced the moment they had been conditioned to fear above all else: contact with the enemy. When the first American soldier appeared in the mouth of Fumiko's cave, she did not see his face. She saw only the silhouette backlit by the afternoon sun, rifle in hand. Her fingers tightened on the scalpel. This was the moment. This was when the training would prove true or false. The soldier did not advance. He stood at the threshold, rifle pointed upward, and called something into the darkness in English. Then, after a pause, he lowered himself to a crouch and placed something on the ground. The metallic clink echoed in the cave. He stood, raised both hands, and backed away from the entrance. Silence. The women stared at the mouth of the cave, waiting for the rush, the violence, the inevitable assault. But the soldier did not return. Minutes passed, then an hour. The light began to change as afternoon slipped toward evening. Finally, the youngest among them, a 16-year-old student nurse named Miyagi Hatsuko, crept forward on her hands and knees toward the object the soldier had left. She lifted it into the shaft of light. It was a canteen military issue with a canvas cover marked with English letters. She unscrewed the cap and sniffed. Water, clean water, not poisoned, at least it didn't smell poisoned. She looked back at the other women, her face a question mark. Fumiko made a decision born of pure physical necessity. They had not drunk in 2 days. Whatever happened next, they needed water. She nodded. Miyagi drank. The women watched her throat work, watched for signs of convulsion or pain. Nothing, just water. After 30 seconds, Fumiko crawled forward and took the canteen. The water was cool, impossibly fresh. She drank and passed it to the next woman. As darkness fell, more objects appeared at the cave entrance. No soldiers came with them, just supplies placed carefully within reach and then left. Cans with English labels, crackers, chocolate bars, cigarettes, a flashlight, and then, most impossibly, a wooden crate containing medical supplies, bandages, antiseptic, morphine syringes with English instructions printed on paper sleeves. This was not the behavior of demons. What the women in that cave could not yet understand was that they had encountered the leading edge of one of the most comprehensive, and in many ways, paradoxical, military occupations in modern history. The American treatment of Japanese prisoners of war, particularly Japanese women, would become a central axis around which the entire post-war relationship between the two nations would ultimately turn. The American military had prepared extensively for this moment. Unlike the Japanese, who had spent the war years perfecting their propaganda about American barbarity, the Americans had spent 1944 and 1945 engaged in an unprecedented anthropological and psychological project. Understanding the Japanese mind in order to defeat it without unnecessary destruction. This effort was led by figures like Ruth Benedict, the anthropologist whose classified study, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, would later become famous. Benedict and her colleagues at the Office of War Information had advised military planners that Japanese cultural concepts of shame and honor created specific vulnerabilities, but also specific protocols for engagement. They noted that Japanese soldiers and civilians, conditioned to expect brutality, might respond positively to demonstrations of mercy, but only if such mercy was framed in ways that preserved face and acknowledged hierarchy. The result was a set of policies that would have seemed extraordinary in the context of total war. American commanders were instructed that Japanese prisoners, particularly women and medical personnel, were to be treated not merely humanely but with deliberate dignity. This wasn't purely altruistic. American planners understood that every Japanese prisoner who survived to tell the story of fair treatment was a powerful propaganda tool against the imperial government's narrative. Every woman who returned home unharmed undermined the suicide propaganda that had cost tens of thousands of civilian lives. But there was also something else at work, something harder to quantify in military planning documents: a genuine American cultural impulse toward protection of women and medical personnel that crossed ideological lines. American soldiers in 1945, despite 4 years of brutal Pacific combat, still carried cultural programming about how to treat nurses and non-combatant women. These values, criticized by some as paternalistic, by others as chivalrous, created a behavioral pattern that Japanese women simply could not reconcile with what they had been taught to expect. The statistics tell part of the story. Between August 15th and September 2nd, 1945, American forces in Okinawa processed approximately 11,000 Japanese military and civilian internees. Of these, roughly 3,800 were women, including approximately 400 military nurses and auxiliary personnel. The sexual assault rate during this period, as documented by both American military police records and subsequent Japanese government investigations, was astonishingly low, fewer than 15 confirmed cases out of thousands of interactions, a rate lower than the sexual assault rate within the American military itself during the same period. This was not an accident. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., before his death in the final days of the Okinawa campaign, had issued explicit orders regarding treatment of female prisoners. The treatment afforded Japanese female military personnel and civilians will be subject to the strictest regulations. His directive read: any member of this command found to have engaged in sexual assault or coercive behavior toward female prisoners will face court-martial without exception. The honor of the United States military and the future relationship with the Japanese people depends upon the scrupulous adherence to these standards. Buckner's successor, General Joseph Stilwell, reinforced these orders with an additional twist: positive incentives. American soldiers who processed Japanese female prisoners with documented compassion received commendations. Medical personnel who provided care to Japanese women received official recognition. The military, in effect, gamified mercy. For Fumiko and the women in her cave, the immediate question was not policy but survival. On the morning of August 16th, after a night spent debating in whispers, they made the decision to emerge. What choice did they have, really? The alternative was slow death by dehydration and starvation. At least if the Americans killed them, it would be quick. They emerged into blinding sunlight, hands raised, expecting gunfire. Instead, they found a scene that contradicted everything in their mental catalog of expectations. The American soldiers who approached them were young, boys, really, barely older than the student nurses themselves. They had their rifles slung over their shoulders, not pointed, and they were smiling. Not the predatory smiles of men about to commit violence, but uncertain, almost nervous grins. One soldier, a medic identifiable by the Red Cross armband over his dusty khaki uniform, stepped forward slowly, his hands visible and empty. He was chewing something, gum Fumiko would later learn, and his face was sunburned and freckled. He looked like he could have been someone's younger brother. He spoke in slow, carefully pronounced Japanese. "Bine, hospital, we take you hospital, food, water, medicine." His accent was terrible, but the meaning was clear. And then he did something that Fumiko would remember for the rest of her life. He bowed. Not a deep formal bow, but a definite inclination of the head and shoulders, a gesture of respect. The women were loaded onto trucks, gently, without rough handling, and transported to a processing center that had been set up in the ruins of Naha. The city was devastated, block after block of rubble where buildings had once stood, but the Americans had erected tents and established what looked like a functioning field hospital. Women in white uniforms moved among the tents. American nurses. Fumiko and her companions were registered, their names carefully recorded by Japanese-American translators who spoke with California accents. They were given medical examinations by female American nurses who worked with professional detachment, checking for wounds and malnutrition. They were deloused, given clean clothes, and then, most astonishingly, fed. The meal was unlike anything Fumiko had ever experienced. There was white bread, impossibly soft and fresh. There was canned meat spam, the translators explained, which tasted salty and rich. There were peaches in syrup, sweet enough to make her teeth ache. There was coffee, hot and bitter and fortifying. And there was chocolate, small brown bars wrapped in paper, which melted on the tongue with a richness that seemed almost obscene after months of eating rice balls and seaweed. But it was the abundance that truly shocked her. Not just that there was food, but that there was so much of it. The Americans served generous portions and then offered seconds. When women couldn't finish their meals, the food was not reclaimed and rationed. It was simply discarded. Fumiko watched in disbelief as American soldiers scraped uneaten spam into garbage bins. In Japan, such waste would have been unthinkable, even criminal. Food had been scarce since 1943, rationed since 1944, nearly non-existent by 1945. Japanese soldiers had starved on Pacific islands while their families subsisted on acorns and wild plants at home. The contrast was not merely economic, it was philosophical. How could a nation waste food like this and still call itself disciplined? The chocolate became Fumiko's touchstone for understanding what had happened. Each day in the internment camp, though camp was too harsh a word for what was essentially a displaced persons processing center, American soldiers distributed rations that included those small chocolate bars. The brand varied: Hershey's, sometimes, or military-issue D-rations that were hard and waxy but still sweet. The soldiers handed them out casually, carelessly even, as if chocolate were as common as stones. Fumiko saved her chocolate bars. She wrapped them carefully in cloth and stored them in her bag, convinced that the abundance would end, that the Americans would soon reveal their true nature. But the chocolate kept coming. Day after day, chocolate and coffee and white bread and canned fruit. The Americans seemed to have infinite supplies of everything. She began to understand that she had been lied to about more than just American brutality. She had been lied to about American capacity. The propaganda had portrayed America as a soft, decadent nation weakened by luxury and lacking the spiritual strength for prolonged war. But the evidence before her eyes told a different story. A nation that could feed its prisoners chocolate daily, that could waste food without consequence, that could deploy field hospitals with abundant medical supplies even after 4 years of global war. This was not a weak nation. This was a nation operating from a surplus so vast that it defied Japanese comprehension. The American soldiers seemed almost embarrassed by their own abundance. Fumiko watched as GIs would pull multiple chocolate bars from their pockets and offer them to children who gathered at the camp fence. They would toss cigarettes to Japanese men with casual generosity. They would open cans of Coca-Cola. Impossibly, there was Coca-Cola in Okinawa in August 1945, and share them with anyone nearby. This wasn't strategic distribution. This was overflow. One evening, Fumiko worked up the courage to speak to one of the American medics through a translator. His name was Corporal James MacDonald from somewhere called Ohio. He had kind eyes and a perpetually sunburned nose. She asked him, through the translator, why the Americans were treating them well. MacDonald looked confused by the question. "Well, ma'am," he said through the translator, "you're nurses, medical personnel. You are doing the same job we do. Why wouldn't we treat you well?" The translator struggled to convey Fumiko's next question. "But didn't you hate us? Weren't we the enemy?" MacDonald considered this. "Yeah," he said finally. "Yeah, we hated the guys shooting at us, but you're not shooting now, the war's over, and you're nurses." He paused, then added, "My sister's a nurse back home, works in Cleveland. I figure somebody's gotta look after the nurses, right?" This answer, filtered through translation and cultural incomprehension, nevertheless carried a meaning that Fumiko found simultaneously baffling and illuminating. The American soldier had divided the world into categories she hadn't expected. Not Japanese versus American, but combatants versus medical personnel, war versus peace. The switch had flipped on August 15th, and with it, the American behavior had changed completely. They could simply stop hatting. They could turn off the war like turning off a light. This capacity for categorical thinking, for compartmentalization, was profoundly foreign to her. In the Japanese military culture she had known, the war was not something you did, it was something you were. Your identity was fused with the conflict. Surrender was not merely tactical defeat but existential obliteration, because it meant the destruction of your fundamental self. But Americans, apparently, could fight savagely one day and distribute chocolate the next without any sense of contradiction. The records of the Okinawa processing centers reveal the systematic nature of American efforts to reverse Japanese propaganda. Military psychologists attached to occupation forces conducted hundreds of interviews with Japanese female prisoners in late August and early September 1945. The goal was partly intelligence gathering, but also partly therapeutic, helping these women process the cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality. Lieutenant Colonel Dorothy Starbuck, an Army nurse who supervised the women's section of the Naha Processing Center, kept detailed notes that were later archived at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Her observations provide remarkable insight into the psychological state of Japanese women in the immediate aftermath of surrender. The initial presentation is almost universally one of extreme fear masked by stoic resignation, Starbuck wrote in her August 20th report. These women expect to be killed or violated. Many have prepared themselves mentally for death. When confronted with ordinary medical care and adequate rations, the reaction is typically disbelief followed by deep confusion. Several have asked me directly if we are fattening them up before eventual execution, a belief apparently derived from propaganda about American practices. Starbuck noted that gaining trust required consistent demonstration rather than verbal assurance. Words mean nothing to them. They have been lied to systematically by their own government. Only repeated evidence, food, medical care, absence of violence, gradually penetrates the defensive shell. The breakthrough, Starbuck observed, often came through small domestic details rather than grand gestures. She recounted the case of a Japanese woman who broke down crying when given a comb and mirror, the first personal grooming items she had been offered in months. Another woman wept at being allowed to bathe in privacy. These mundane dignities, taken for granted by American personnel, represented profound reversals of expectation for women who had been taught that captivity meant total dehumanization. But perhaps most significantly, Starbuck noted the role of female American personnel in the psychological transformation. The presence of American women, nurses, WACs, Red Cross workers, is critical to breaking through Japanese propaganda. These women had been told that American women were immoral and coarse, that they lacked femininity and decency. Finding themselves cared for by professional American nurses who are both competent and kind creates an undeniable counter-narrative. The American military had not accidentally included substantial numbers of women in occupation forces. This was deliberate policy, based on anthropological advice about Japanese cultural sensitivities. The presence of American women demonstrated civilization and domesticity, qualities the propaganda had claimed Americans lacked. It made the occupation less threatening while simultaneously more impressive. These Americans were so confident in their power that they brought their women into a war zone. By early September, Fumiko had been transferred to a larger displaced persons facility in central Okinawa, where several thousand Japanese civilians and military personnel awaited repatriation to the main islands. The camp was surprisingly well organized, with separate sections for families, unaccompanied men and women. The Americans had established schools for children, organized medical clinics, and even arranged for Japanese administrators to handle day-to-day operations under American supervision. Fumiko worked in the camp hospital, which was jointly staffed by Japanese nurses and American medical personnel. Here, in the daily routine of treating patients and managing medical supplies, she experienced what would become a common phenomenon in occupied Japan: the strange intimacy of working alongside former enemies. The American doctor she assisted most frequently was Captain Richard Hayes, a surgeon from Massachusetts who had served in the Pacific for 3 years. Hayes was technically skilled and utterly matter-of-fact in his treatment of Japanese patients. He showed no trace of animosity, no hint of moral superiority. He simply did his job. When supplies ran short, which was rare, but occasionally happened, he showed no panic, unlike Japanese doctors she had worked with who had operated in a constant state of material desperation. What struck Fumiko most was Hayes's attitude toward waste. In the Japanese military hospitals, every scrap of bandage was reused until it fell apart. Surgical instruments were improvised from whatever materials were available. Medicine was hoarded and rationed with excruciating care. But Hayes would discard a partly used bandage without thought. He would open a new packet of sutures rather than resterilize old ones. When Fumiko, compulsively, began collecting discarded medical materials to clean and reuse, Hayes noticed and gently stopped her. "We have more," he said through the translator. "It's fine, use new supplies." But it wasn't fine, not to Fumiko. The casual disposal of usable materials felt like a moral failing, an offense against the principle of Matanai, the Buddhist-influenced Japanese concept that waste is shameful, that every object has inherent value that must be honored through complete use. Yet Hayes didn't seem immoral. He seemed, if anything, more concerned with patient care than the Japanese doctors she had known, because he wasn't distracted by constant resource anxiety. She began to perceive the arithmetic of abundance. When you have enough, you can afford to prioritize quality over conservation. When supplies are infinite, or close enough to infinite, you can focus entirely on optimal outcomes rather than acceptable compromises. Japanese military medicine had been a constant exercise in tragic triage, in making impossible choices about who deserved the limited resources. American military medicine, apparently, didn't have to make those choices. One evening, while organizing medical supplies in the hospital storeroom, Fumiko found herself alone with Hayes. Through the translator who remained nearby, she asked a question that had been forming for weeks. "Why did you not hate us?" Hayes looked up from the inventory list he was checking. He was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "I did hate you. Not you personally, I didn't know you existed. But I hated the Japanese military. I hated what happened at Pearl Harbor and Wake Island and the Bataan March. I had friends who died on those islands. I saw what your military did to prisoners." Fumiko felt the familiar weight of shame settling on her shoulders, but Hayes continued. "But here's what I figured out somewhere around Tarawa. Hating you doesn't help me do my job. My job is to fix people. If I spend my energy hatting, I don't have enough left over to save lives, so I made a choice. When I'm working, I'm a doctor. Not an American, not your enemy, just a doctor. The person on my operating table is a patient, not a Japanese soldier or civilian, just a patient. This explanation, emerging haltingly through translation, resonated with something Fumiko had been struggling to articulate. The Americans had the luxury of choosing their identities, of compartmentalizing their roles. They could be soldiers when fighting and doctors when healing. They could hate in one context and show kindness in another without experiencing it as hypocrisy or weakness. This flexibility, this ability to turn emotions on and off based on utility, was itself a kind of freedom that Japanese military culture had never permitted. The repatriation process began in late September 1945. Japanese civilians and military personnel were being shipped back to the home islands aboard American transport vessels, a massive logistical undertaking that would eventually move millions of people. Fumiko and the other nurses from Okinawa were among the first groups scheduled for return. The journey to Sasebo on Kyushu took 3 days aboard a Liberty ship converted for passenger transport. The ship was crowded but adequately supplied, with mess halls serving the same surplus American rations they had received in the camps. The Japanese passengers were given designated sleeping areas with basic bedding. American naval personnel maintained order but did so with minimal intrusion. For Fumiko, the 3-day voyage provided time for reflection. She stood at the ship's rail in the evenings, watching the Pacific slide past, and tried to process what had happened to her understanding of the world. Everything she had been taught had proven false. The Americans were not demons. They had not raped and murdered prisoners. They had instead fed them chocolate and provided medical care, and treated them with a casual decency that was somehow more devastating than cruelty would have been. Cruelty she could have understood. Cruelty would have confirmed the narrative, would have validated the suicides, would have made sense of the propaganda. But this mundane kindness, this bureaucratic competence, this overwhelming material abundance, these things shattered her worldview more completely than violence ever could. She thought about the chocolate bars still wrapped in cloth in her bag. She had eaten a few, but most remained, saved as evidence or talisman. What did they prove? That America was rich. She had known that abstractly. But this was different. This was wealth so profound that it expressed itself in the casual disposal of luxury goods to prisoners. This was power so complete that it could afford mercy. Other women gathered at the rail near her, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of copper and violet. Someone mentioned the Emperor's broadcast, which most of them had not heard directly but had learned about secondhand. The Emperor's voice, never before heard by commoners, had announced the unendurable and called for acceptance of the unacceptable. "What will we tell people?" one of the younger nurses asked. "When we get home, what do we say about what happened?" It was a harder question than it seemed. The truth would sound like propaganda in reverse, like they had been brainwashed by the enemy. Who would believe that American soldiers had given them chocolate, that they had been treated with respect, that not one of them had been violated? The truth would dishonor the memory of those who had committed suicide rather than face capture. It would make their death seem pointless, a waste based on lies. "We tell the truth," Fumiko said finally. "We tell them exactly what happened." But even as she said it, she knew it would not be that simple. The Japan that Fumiko returned to in October 1945 was a nation in profound psychological crisis. The physical destruction was immense. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other cities had been reduced to ash by firebombing. But the mental destruction ran deeper. The Japanese people had been told they were fighting a holy war, that their cause was just, that their enemies were subhuman. They had sacrificed everything for this narrative. And now they had to confront the possibility that the sacrifice had been based on lies. The American occupation of Japan, which would last from September 1945 to April 1952, represented one of the most ambitious experiments in cultural transformation ever attempted. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, approached the task with a mixture of imperial hauteur and genuine reformist zeal. His mission was not merely to control Japan, but to remake it, to transform a militaristic empire into a peaceful democracy allied with the West. The treatment of Japanese women became a critical front in this cultural war. MacArthur's headquarters issued explicit orders regarding fraternization and conduct toward Japanese women. The orders were complex, even contradictory. American personnel were instructed to maintain professional distance while also demonstrating American values of gender equality and respect. Formal fraternization was initially forbidden, then gradually permitted under strict guidelines. But on the ground, among the hundreds of thousands of American servicemen occupying Japan, the reality was more complicated. Some Americans treated Japanese women with the respect and courtesy that had characterized the POW camps. Others were less noble, and incidents of sexual assault, while statistically rare relative to the size of the occupation force, did occur and were prosecuted with varying degrees of effectiveness. Yet the overall pattern held. American behavior toward Japanese civilians, particularly women, was substantially more restrained than what Japanese propaganda had predicted, or what had characterized Japanese military behavior in occupied territories. This restraint was partly due to military discipline, partly due to American cultural values, and partly due to pragmatic calculation. MacArthur understood that winning Japanese cooperation required demonstrating that occupation would not mean humiliation. The result was what historian John Dower would later term the embrace of defeat, a remarkably rapid Japanese psychological pivot from fanatical resistance to enthusiastic cooperation with occupation authorities. This pivot was enabled by several factors: the emperor's personal endorsement of surrender, the physical and emotional exhaustion of the Japanese people, and the dawning realization that American occupation was not the apocalypse they had been promised. Women like Fumiko played a crucial role in this transformation, though their contributions were often invisible. When they told their stories, tentatively at first, then more openly, they provided counter-evidence to the propaganda narrative. Each woman who returned from American captivity alive and unharmed undermined the justification for suicide. Each account of American abundance highlighted the lies about American weakness. Each experience of decent treatment raised questions about what else the government had misrepresented. Fumiko returned to her family home in Kumamoto in November 1945 to find her parents' house still standing but her father dead from malnutrition-related illness 3 months earlier. Her mother, thin as wire, wept when she saw her daughter alive. The neighborhood was full of widows and orphans. Food remained scarce, though American relief supplies were beginning to arrive in larger quantities. At first, Fumiko told no one about her experience as a prisoner. The shame of capture, the failure to choose honorable death, weighed heavily. But gradually, as she helped establish a civilian clinic in Kumamoto with American medical supplies, she began to share pieces of her story. The reactions were complex. Some people refused to believe her. Others listened with hungry attention, desperate for evidence that the world might not be entirely hopeless. The chocolate she had saved became her most powerful piece of evidence. She would unwrap one of the bars, its paper wrapping creased but intact, and show it to skeptics. Here was an American product, given freely to prisoners. Here was proof of abundance. Some people wept at the sight of it, not from hunger but from the implications. If this was true, then what else might be possible? Over time, Fumiko came to understand that her experience represented something larger than personal survival. She had witnessed, firsthand, the material and philosophical gulf between wartime Japan and America. She had experienced the difference between a nation fighting for survival from depleted resources and a nation fighting from surplus. She had encountered a culture that could wage total war while still maintaining certain ethical boundaries, that could hate collectively while showing individual mercy. This knowledge was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it meant the future might hold possibilities beyond what Japanese militarism had offered. Devastating because it meant the suffering of the war, the suicides, the starvation, the destruction, had been based on a false understanding of reality. Her father had died believing in Japanese spiritual superiority over American material excess. But material excess, it turned out, was itself a kind of power that spiritual superiority could not overcome. The chocolate, that recurring symbol, appeared again and again in post-war Japanese accounts of American occupation. In memoirs, in interviews, in oral histories collected decades later, former prisoners and civilians consistently mentioned the chocolate. Sometimes it was Hershey bars. Sometimes it was military D-rations. Sometimes it was just the concept of chocolate. The idea that Americans had so much sugar, so much cocoa, so much excess productive capacity that they could manufacture luxury goods for soldiers and prisoners, while their own civilians also enjoyed abundance. The chocolate was never just chocolate. It was a metonym for American power, American wealth, American generosity, American waste, American incomprehensibility. It was the physical manifestation of the gap between what Japanese propaganda had promised and what reality delivered. It was small enough to fit in a palm but large enough to symbolize an entire worldview. Food historians have noted that chocolate occupies a particular position in cross-cultural encounters because it is both unnecessary and highly desirable. It provides no essential nutrition but triggers powerful pleasure responses. A nation that gives chocolate to prisoners is advertising not just its material wealth but its psychological confidence. It is saying, we have so much that we can afford to give away things purely for pleasure. We are not merely surviving, we are thriving. For Japanese prisoners who had been surviving on minimal rations for months or years, who had been taught that sacrifice and deprivation were signs of moral virtue, the chocolate was cognitively destabilizing. It suggested that American abundance was not a moral failing, but a source of strength. It implied that maybe comfort and plenty were not incompatible with discipline and power. It raised the possibility that the entire Japanese wartime ideology had been exactly backward. Fumiko kept the last chocolate bar in her possession for 3 years until 1948. She never ate it. It was a reminder, a piece of evidence, a touchstone. Eventually, in 1948, with Japan slowly recovering under American-drafted democratic reforms, she threw it away. Not because she no longer needed the reminder, but because she finally believed the evidence had been integrated into her understanding of history. The chocolate could not be preserved forever. But the lesson it represented had become permanent. The transformation of Japanese female attitudes toward Americans during the occupation period is documented extensively in both American and Japanese archives. By 1947, just 2 years after surrender, polls showed that Japanese women were more optimistic about American-style democracy than Japanese men, more supportive of women's suffrage, which the American occupation had mandated, and more willing to embrace social reforms. This was not universal. Plenty of Japanese women maintained traditional values or harbored resentment toward the occupiers. But among those who had direct experience with Americans during the war's end, particularly those who had been prisoners, the pattern was striking. They had been shown, empirically, that their government had lied to them. They had been offered, tangibly, a different model of how power could be exercised and how conflicts could end. Some of these women became important figures in post-war Japan's reconstruction. Fumiko herself, though her name has been changed here to protect her privacy, went on to become a prominent public health nurse in Kyushu, working on maternal and child health programs that incorporated American medical practices. Other women from the Haimuri Student Nurse Corps became teachers, social workers, and activists, many of them explicitly influenced by their wartime experiences and their encounters with American values. The irony, of course, is that American treatment of Japanese female prisoners was not